We are doing the basics of healthy spirituality, and we are looking at the concept of God is with us. In a name, the name that we have for this concept is Emmanuel. Now, you are probably familiar with the name Emmanuel, particularly as we head toward the end of the year and Christmas season. A lot of Christmas songs come to mind when we say the name Emmanuel, and we assume that when the gospel writers tell us the story about Jesus, they use the name Emmanuel all the time. Well, there are 4 gospel writers who tell the story of Jesus, and of these 4 gospel writers, only one of them uses the name Emmanuel, and that is the first gospel writer, which is Matthew. In his gospel, he actually only uses the name Emmanuel once, and it's when he's talking about the birth of Jesus. You see, Matthew claims that Jesus' mother had an immaculate conception and that this Christ child was born by way of a miraculous conception. And so for that reason, as you can imagine, her fiancé, a man named Joseph, was very concerned when his wife became pregnant and he heard her story. And he made plans to quietly divorce her and then move on with his life. But then when he was at sleep one night, an angel visited him and told him that this was all part of God's plan. It's something that had been predicted for a long time, and that Joseph should trust his fiancé. Now, it's here that Matthew, the person who's writing the story, cuts away from that story and adds a bit of narrator part in which he says the name Emmanuel. We read, all of this happened to fulfill what God had said through the prophet. The virgin will be with child and give birth, and the child will be named Emmanuel, a name that means God is with us. Now, if you are new to Paradox, welcome. We're glad that you're here. Whenever we come across a passage of Scripture that quotes another passage of Scripture, we always do our best to try to figure out what that original author that's being quoted has to say in the first place. So when Matthew says the prophet says this, we should immediately think of the context of who the prophet was and what the prophet was trying to say. Now, if you grew up in a Protestant Christian tradition, you grew up with these 66 books as your Bible, and of these 66 books that I grew up with in my Bible, 16 of them are designated as the prophets. And if you grew up in church like I did, and you asked the church, "Oh, church, what's the point of the prophets?" the church would almost unanimously say something like this: the purpose of the prophets is to predict the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This wasn't just some random guy who was born in a field in Bethlehem. This was part of God's plan all along, and God told prophets for centuries before the birth of Jesus that Jesus would eventually show up, so that you could rest in confidence knowing that this was, in fact, the Son of God. And I believed this for the majority of my life. And I remember when I was 18 years old, I 100% believed this. I drove a Dodge Neon SRT. There I am at 18. Yes, and when I was driving my Dodge Neon SRT, I was a good Christian boy. I was so good, I would listen to Christian radio and only Christian radio. You know what I'm saying? And I remember there was this PSA they would play on Christian radio where they would say that there are all kinds of prophecies in the Bible that predicted the life of Jesus. And all of these prophecies together make it so, they're so specific and there's so many of them that the chances of Jesus just being a random guy who happens to meet all the prophecies in the Bible is not an insignificant number. In fact, they said it's 1 in 10 to the 17th power. I had to look up what 10 to the 17th power is, and it's 100 quadrillion, which is a number I never use in my normal vernacular, right? And I remember being 18 years old, driving my Dodge Neon, and I would hear this, and I would just swell with pride as I thought to myself, I love being right. Hallelujah. What's the next song, right? I'll tell you, while I did love being right, those socks that I was wearing were definitely wrong, so I'm not sure how much I loved being right, but that's who I was. Anyways, I point this out because when we talk about the prophet predicting the life of Christ, we should ask which prophet was this? And if we look at all 66 books of the Bible, Matthew is actually referring to a part of the prophecy that is in the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah lived sometime around the 8th century BCE. And if you go to Isaiah, you will find that this prophecy that Matthew refers to is found in chapter 7, where we read these words. Then Isaiah said, "Listen, O house of David, is it not enough for you to weary those around you? Must you also weary my God? Therefore, the Holy One will give you a sign. This virgin will become pregnant and will give birth. You will name the child Emmanuel, and he will be the Savior of the world. He will be blameless, and yet he will be crucified on a cross. But fear not, for he will be resurrected from the grave as a sign of God's power over death. And when we read that, we think to ourselves, well, that specifically names the story of Jesus. It's a very obvious prediction. We can trust that this was not an accident that occurred, and it sounds good, and it reassures us in our faith. There's just one problem. The prophecy does not say any of that last part. I made all of that up. Instead, the prophecy says, you will name the child Emmanuel. This child will be living on curds and honey by the time it knows how to refuse evil and do good. But before that time, before the child knows how to refuse evil and do good, the land of the two rulers you dread will be laid waste. Well, which two rulers are we talking about? What do you mean, curds and honey? Did Jesus eat curds and honey? What is a curd? Why are we talking about what this person will eat? Because every human being eats. It's not a big prediction to say there will be a baby born sometime in the future that eats food. That's not a bold prediction. And if you're like me, you read this and you think to yourself, this is a strange way to predict the incarnation of God in 700 years, right? 700 years after Isaiah lives is when Jesus is born. What a strange way to supposedly predict that Jesus will be the Son of God and live a life like this. But it gets even stranger when you look closely at that word virgin, which I put an asterisk next to. I put an asterisk there because it's actually not in the inclusive Bible. It is a word that shows up in Christian translations of Isaiah and only in Christian translations. The reason it shows up in Christian translations is because it's from the Hebrew word alma. Let me hear you say alma this morning. And alma just means young woman. And while Christian translations often translate it as virgin to help it match Matthew's prophecy in chapter 1, Jewish translations and the more scholarly translations will always translate it as young woman. And I know I'm treading on sacred ground here, but this is what we do here at Paradox. This is the only time that Isaiah refers to a young woman giving birth. And when you look through all the different prophecies, you realize that there is something stunning that comes to the fore when you start to think about the implications of this, because Isaiah never actually predicted a virgin birth. And since he's the only one that supposedly talked about it, it means that no other prophet predicted a virgin birth for Jesus. And so when you look at these 16 books in the middle of the Bible, the question becomes, well, if they didn't predict the life of Jesus, what was their purpose? Why do we have them here? And when you look at the prophets closely and you read through each of them, you realize that these prophets do talk about the future sometimes, but they mostly talk about the here and now in their own day and age. In fact, the prophets barely predict anything more than about 100 years beyond their own lifetime. That's about as far out as they're willing to go. And instead, the prophets always write about political convictions and religious commentary. So they talk about how their government should be reshaped. They talk about how their religion needs to be reformed. They talk about that over and over again. And there's some prophets that you will probably agree with in 2024, and there are other prophets that you probably wouldn't agree with as much, right? Because they all have their ideas of how things should be run. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, Craig, I don't really read political commentary now. Why would I want to read about it 2,700 years ago in a context I don't understand? I will tell you that I found that it is worth studying the prophets because they do relate to us today as long as you're willing to dive into the context. And so I want us to dive into the context of what Isaiah was saying in this prophecy because I think it's really valuable for us today because he named that name Emmanuel and said God is with us in some form today or in the near future. So let's go back 2,700 years ago. No, let's go back even further, 3,000 years ago to a time before the nation of Israel even existed. Back then, there were 12 tribes of Israel, and they were all scattered about. They all had their own systems of governments. They all had their own heads of their tribe, which were known as judges. And then along came Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, and he took the 12 tribes and he formed it into one nation known as Israel. Theologians and historians refer to this process as, of course, consolidation. I'm here every Saturday, everyone. Yes. Yeah, some people wanted to give it applause. The others were like, don't. Do not. I can only tell that joke when my wife's not here, so thank you for allowing me to share it. Anyways, Saul's family was violently overthrown by David. David then became the king of Israel, and he led it, according to the story, into economic prosperity and military might. His son took over, Solomon, and he took what his father handed him, and he grew Israel to an even more powerful and more rich nation. He did this particularly by enslaving his own people, which he figured out he could increase his margin of profit if he didn't pay his workers. And so Solomon did that for 40 years until he died, and the people of Israel were done. They were so annoyed. So they went to the next king, a man named Rehoboam, and they said, look, we did 4 decades with your dad. He was awful. Yes, we're rich, but who cares? We're not getting paid. Please do not enslave us. And Rehoboam looks at the workers and he says, I'm going to think about it. So he goes on a retreat for 3 days, and he meets with his closest advisors, and there's 2 camps of advisors that talk to him. One camp is the older advisors, and they say, Rehoboam, you have the chance to be a good king who speaks good words into the lives of people, then they will respect and honor you if you treat them with dignity. Or, the second group said, you could go to them and hold out your little finger and say, this little finger is way bigger than my daddy's genitals, and you ain't seeing nothing yet. And Rehoboam says, I like the second option. And one of my favorite paintings of Rehoboam is in Switzerland. It's this one here, where it's actually him holding out his little finger as he goes back to the people of Israel and says, you ain't seen nothing yet. This made the people of Israel furious. So mad that 10 of the tribes said, we've had enough of this United Nation thing, we're done. And they actually split the nation into 2, with the northern nation known as Israel and the southern nation known as Judah. And Rehoboam and David's grandsons after that would reign on the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, while the 10 tribes seceded and formed their own nation, which they took the name with them and formed Israel. This is imperative to understand what's going on in the book of Isaiah, because about 150-ish years later, there is a man named Ahaz who is the king of Judah. Now, this is a terrible picture that I have of Ahaz. It's like the only picture on the internet because no one is talking about King Ahaz, and yet he was a very influential figure within Judah's history. Now, Ahaz falls in David's line here. All of these are direct descendants of David, with the exception of Athaliah, who was the only queen in Judah's history. But Ahaz there, he was David's direct descendant, and he was living at a time when all sorts of political fracturing was happening. Not only was there Israel to the north, which tensions had been tough ever since they seceded, but there was also a nation to the east, I think that is, east, to the east of them known as Aram. And Aram and Israel did not like each other until there was a new nation, a new empire to the north known as Assyria. Now, Assyria was so big and so bad, it was referred to as an empire, and all of a sudden Aram went to their enemies, Israel, and they said, hey, we're not going to win if Assyria invades us. Why don't the smaller nations in this area form an alliance and band together and attack Assyria, and then we'll win a war against them before they can come and invade us? Israel, the northern kingdom, said, that's great, let's go talk to Judah. They both went to Judah, both kings go to Judah, to King Ahaz, and they say to King Ahaz, we want to form an alliance and take on the empire of Assyria. Ahaz thinks this is a terrible idea. He thinks it's an awful idea, and he says, I will not join your alliance. To which the kings of Israel and Aram say to Judah, well, then it's war with us. And so Israel and Aram take on Judah in war, and it's in this context that Isaiah writes his 7th chapter and declares that this is what's going on, and his prophecy speaks to this specific moment. Now, you may say to yourself, how do you expect me to know all of this when I read the book of Isaiah? And the answer is you have to read the whole thing, because in chapter 7, where that prophecy occurs, Isaiah actually tells us all of this, even if he's a lot more brief than I was in just a moment ago. He writes these words, in the days of Ahaz, king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and King Pekah of Israel went up to attack Jerusalem. So they're marching on Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and they're saying, we're going to put this city under siege, and they're successful in putting it under siege, and they're trying to starve the people of Judah out. Isaiah continues and says, when word came to Judah that Aram had allied itself with Israel, the heart of Ahaz and the people shook as the trees of the forest shake in the wind. In other words, these people are scared, terrified. They think their way of life and their people will be wiped out any moment now because there's no way Judah can take on the larger nation of Israel and its ally Aram once they unleash the full might of their military. So Isaiah chapter 7 then unfolds in the throne room with King Ahaz and the prophet Isaiah. And Ahaz turns to Isaiah and says, where is God in the midst of all of this uncertainty and fear that we are facing as a nation? And Isaiah says to the frightened king these words. Then Isaiah said, listen, O house of David, is it not enough for you to weary those around you? Must you also weary my God? Therefore, the Holy One will give you a sign. This young woman will become pregnant and will give birth. Now, it's here we may ask the question, which young woman? Well, you can imagine in this throne room, there's a young woman standing there. Scholars believe that it's actually Isaiah's wife because she gives birth in the next chapter. And he points at the young woman and says, hey, God's going to give us a sign. This young woman will become pregnant, not a bold prediction from her husband, right? And she will give birth. He goes on to say, you will name the child, says to the woman, you will name the child Emmanuel, and this child will be living on curds and honey by the time it knows how to refuse evil and do good. You don't eat honey while you're under siege. You don't eat curds while you're under siege. These are foods from a feast. These are luxuries. And so Isaiah is saying this child will be living on curds and honey by the time it knows how to refuse evil and do good. But before that time, before the child knows how to refuse evil and do good, the land of the two rulers, Israel, Aram, you dread, will be laid waste. And so when you consider the context of this story, Isaiah basically says to this frightened and terrified king, hey, within a few years, the threat from this alliance between Israel and Aram will be over, and we will return to eating good food and living carefree. God is with us now, and God will see us through. And Isaiah was mostly right, because Ahaz was probably inspired by Isaiah's word. He came up with a plan for how he was going to get around this alliance between Israel and Aram. He sent messengers to Assyria and said, hey, these other nations, they're about to start a war against you. Can we please ally with you? Would you come help us before they lay waste to us? And we promise we won't put up any resistance if you want to bring us into your empire. Oh, and by the way, here's a bunch of gold and silver and riches. Assyria said, sure. And within just a few years, by 722 BCE, Assyria eventually said they'd had enough, and they laid waste to Israel and Aram, and Judah, against all odds, somehow survived this story. Now, about 700-ish years after that, there is a man who is born, whose name is Jesus. He grows up, he lives his life, he meets another man named Matthew, and Matthew is just blown away by this guy. So inspired, so overwhelmed by who this person is, and he is convinced that this person represented the very incarnation of God. And as he is feeling all of those things, Jesus goes through his life, he's eventually crucified, and then Matthew witnesses his resurrection after his death. And Matthew says, I want to tell his story. And he says, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to connect it to our larger story as a people so that I can tell other people about the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ? And so he sits down and he says, hey, the birth of Jesus occurred in the exact way that Isaiah predicted. And if Isaiah heard that, I have a feeling that he would hear it and say, what? What are you talking about? And Matthew would say, oh yeah, you said the young woman should give birth. That happened in my lifetime. And it's like Matthew looks back through his own lens and his own context, and he says, okay, a long time ago, Isaiah predicted that this kid would be born, and this kid would grow up and be the savior of the world. But let's put that idea in its historical context And let's see how it plays out, because I find it to be rather comical. Imagine that that's exactly the way that God wanted everything to play out when Ahaz and Isaiah are in the throne room, right? Israel and Aram are breathing down their neck. Ahaz turns to Isaiah and says, Isaiah, please, we're all going to die. Where is God? Does God even care that we are suffering? And instead, Isaiah steps forward and says, oh, Ahaz, 700 years from now, God is going to do something really special. Just wait, it's going to be great. We'll all be dead, but it's going to be great. Now, you can imagine Ahaz would respond by saying, how does this help us now when Aram and Israel are about to kill us? To which Isaiah would say, oh, it doesn't. We're actually screwed. And if this happened over text, I imagine he'd add an emoji like this, like, what are we going to do? I point this out because Isaiah didn't go to Ahaz and say, hey, God will be with us eventually. Who knows when, but it's a long ways in the future. Instead, Isaiah went to Ahaz in a very desperate situation and said to the king, even in the face of death, O king, God is with us. Even in the face of death, here in 730 BCE, when we're outnumbered, we're under siege, and we know we're going to die, God is still with us. And Ahaz thinks about this, and against all odds, figures out a way with the people of Judah to survive because he feels like they shouldn't give up. Now, 700 years later, a whole lot of things have changed, right? 700 years, things are vastly different. There's no king from this nation. Instead, they are part of the empire of Rome. And these people are trying to make sense of how God cares about them when they are so oppressed, disempowered, and heavily taxed. And Matthew's so inspired by this life of Jesus that when he writes his story, he says, hey, the birth of Jesus occurred in the way Isaiah predicted. Well, that, my friends, is called a proof text, and it's considered bad scholarship. But I have a lot of empathy for Matthew here, because Matthew didn't have, a master's of divinity. Matthew didn't have this whole biblical scholarship and all the years and centuries that have happened that say this is how to treat the Bible with respect. Matthew lived in a context where people were whispering, God will liberate us soon. And when Matthew witnessed that firsthand, he says, oh, there's something connected here to whatever Isaiah felt 700 years ago. And the way I like to think of Matthew writing this is much less, well, the birth of Jesus occurred in the exact way Isaiah predicted. I think if we assume the best about Matthew, I think it's much closer to so much has changed in 700 years. But even though everything has changed, power structures, taxation, hope, even though it's all changed, God is still with us. Think about that gap from Isaiah to Matthew, 700 years. And then consider how far the gap is from us to Matthew. It's about 3 times the gap from Isaiah to Matthew. It was almost 2,100 years ago that Jesus walked on the other side of the world. And what's interesting to me is when I think about churches and how churches talk about Jesus today, they often love to tell stories about the Bible, right? And they love to tell the stories about the miracles and God interacting with humanity and God changing the course of humanity. And they always talk about God back then. And it's like they stand up and they say, we have good news. God was with us. And then they say, if you're discouraged by this, just remember you can give your life to Jesus, and eventually, someday in the future, Jesus will come back and God will be with us again. And then they kind of say that God is with us, but if you read between the lines, it really sounds like they're saying, but God isn't with us now. And then it's almost like they're saying to each of us, we're so unlucky. I mean, if we just would have been born a little bit earlier or a little bit later, then we could have seen God face to face, right? And it's almost like there's this sense that we can acknowledge God will be with us or God was with us, but it takes courage to say that God is with us in the face of all of the imperfections and suffering we see in this world now. Shouldn't churches then, if we are serious about the concept of Emmanuel, be able to stand up and say, yes, It's been 2,000 years since Jesus walked the earth. Yes, it's been 2,700 years since Isaiah first uttered Emmanuel. So much has changed. Science, all sorts of economies, countries, languages, so much has changed. But you know what we have found? In this world, God is still with us. And God will not be more present in the future, and God was not more present in the past. God is with us here and now just as much as our spiritual ancestors, as God will be with our spiritual descendants. So much has changed, but in this imperfect and strange world, God is still with us. In other words, a healthy church will always lead people back to Emmanuel. If we're talking about healthy spirituality and you're part of a church, your church should help you see how God is present in everything you encounter. And that God is not more present in the future or more present in the past. God is as present as God needs to be right here and right now because we worship a personal and loving God. Now, we have several atheists and agnostics here at Paradox. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. If I were speaking to you, I would talk to you specifically about spirituality in this way. We define spirituality as one's relationship with the entire experience of being human. And for me, what I found is this is really hard to have a healthy relationship with your entire experience of being human if you're completely isolated. It's really hard because you end up being very myopic. You become obsessed with your own experiences over others. And it's hard to be a healthy person unless you're in community. And so for all my atheist agnostic siblings who are here today, I would say that everyone needs a community that helps them grow in appreciation for the entire experience of being human. That may be this church, it may be another church, it may be a non-religious body entirely. But all of us need a community that helps us grow in appreciation for the entire, yes, even the bad parts, experience of being human. And so I would ask each of us to consider, where does that happen in our lives? And my hope is that if you are part of this church, whether you're atheist, agnostic, or Christian, my hope is that this church helps you to grow in that appreciation of being human. And it's not just one person. Yes, I have the privilege and the honor of being able to speak at a regular basis at this church. But we have to remember that Emmanuel does not mean God is with me. It means that God is with us. And as the great Richard Rohr once said, I've heard him say this many times, he said, the lone individual is far too fragile to bear either the weight of glory or the burden of sin. God is with us means a community. And when I think about all of the beautiful people in this church community, I think about how much each of you have helped me to grow in appreciation for the entire experience of being human, or I think about how each of you have helped me to see that God is with us, especially in the really difficult things in life. The questions we need to ask ourselves are, how have the people in my church, whether it's this church or another church, helped me to trust God is with us in an imperfect world? Or a more practical way to answer or ask this question is, how have the people in my church helped me to love the entire experience of being human? I want to share with you 3 stories about how this congregation has helped me to grow an appreciation of being human, as well as to see how God is still with us. The first story takes place a long time ago, back when we were still moving the church in a trailer from building to building. It was exhausting. I was much younger back then. I can't do that anymore, and I'm glad we're here. But it was during this time that, I don't know if you know this, but in 2016, when our church started, there was a very controversial presidential candidate that ran, and he really brought a lot of the tensions that we'd all been feeling and had buried to the surface, and it was a very tense time to start a church. And he's still running for president, and I've had to deal with him my whole pastoral career at this church, which has just been a fantastic experience. You can decide for yourself if that's sarcastic or not. I tell you this, though, because there was a lot of tensions around one particular topic at our elder board, and we were trying to decide if we should speak about this openly or not. And during this elder board meeting, our church was brand new at this point, There was a lot of tears. There was a lot of misunderstandings. There was a lot of back and forth when it went to who it was that we should, or who we should be representing in the community and what values we should be communicating. And everyone stayed at that elders meeting for hours, like 2 hours. And then we wrapped up the meeting. We kind of came to a place where we figured out how to move forward. And then after that, everyone stayed for another 2 hours, just talking to each other in a much less controversial kind of tone. And I got home to my wife. She was like, "What took so long?" I was like, "You wouldn't believe the elders meeting we just went through." And after I told her, she looked at me, I told her, and I said, "I'm really discouraged. Like, I thought we were all on the same page on this." And she looked at me and she said, "Is that the point, Craig? For you all to be on the same page? Or is it to get people who normally don't talk to each other talking to each other so we can find a common way forward?" And I was like, "Do you want to preach the sermon next week, Kimmy? Because it's better than anything I could come up with." The second story isn't really a specific story, but it's a story that happens frequently, and I think of the specific names, but it's a lot of people's here story. There's this moment when people start attending this church where we try to get coffee with every new person just so it's not just a faceless or anonymous kind of experience this church. And there's always this moment where someone decides that they're going to be honest about their spirituality in the coffee usually. And they always start to be honest with a little bit of fear and hesitation because they don't know if we'll all of a sudden say, "Oh, there's no space for you here," or "If you don't believe in God, you can't really lead songs from the front," or "You can't participate unless you agree to our mission statement," something like that, right? And so over coffee, over lunch, over dinner, I've heard several people in this room say, "I'm agnostic," or, I barely believe in God," or, "I really believe that God authors every instance of life. Is there room for me here?" And the answer is, of course. Of course there's room for you here without any expectation of conversion. Because we will never operate as a church where we would love you more because you converted to our religion. That's not really love, that's just arrogance, isn't it? And so we try our best to invite people to be who they are and find ways to become more loving people, whether they identify as part of this religion or believe something else or practice something else. I have a friend who, when we talked recently, he lived in another state and he was telling me about his church experience. And he just said he was getting more and more bored with church, and he felt more and more disconnected. And after talking to him for a bit, he said, "I just feel like if they passed a microphone at our church and said, 'What do you believe?' and I actually said it, they would not welcome me at all." And I heard that, and I felt for my friend, and I said, that is one of the most genuine concerns or critiques of church I've ever heard. And since that moment, we have tried our best to be a church that if we passed a microphone, you could say what you feel like needs to be said about what you believe and who you are, and you would be accepted here. Now, of course, as you can imagine, there has to be some limits on that, because if you start spewing hate speech toward other people, we have to stop those things and make sure that we make this a safe space for all, which brings us to the third story. So I was recently with someone who attends this church and identifies a bit more conservative than me, and we were talking about some of the current issues of the day, and she had gone to a place with a lot of progressives, and they just basically told her how terrible she was the whole time. And after she told me this story, she said, "I just feel like there needs to be a space where I can ask questions, and if I say a few wrong words, it's okay." And I said, "You're absolutely right. There should be places you can ask questions, and every sincere question deserves an answer. And so while you can't ask any question in any environment, we try to create environments here at Paradox that allow you to ask questions even if you don't get all the words right. Because we have this sense that people can change, whether it's more in one direction or another, as long as they are being led to greater love." And so when I think about this community and what it's taught me and how it's shown me who the divine is, I have story after story like this, and while it's good for me to share stories with you, my hope is that you've experienced something similar at this community, or if you're a visitor, you have some other community, whether it's religious or not, that will help you process and walk through some of the hardest things that human beings experience, some of the hardest things that you experience. Because for me, that's what the whole concept of God with us means. And so, my friends, may you find a community who helps you to love the entire experience of being human, and may you experience firsthand that God is with us. Amen.